Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the first half of Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a little bit long, so I thought it makes sense to break it up into two parts. So we'll talk about roughly till about page 122, 123. This chapter, unlike some of the others that were so frenetic and action-packed, this one seems a little bit different in its style and its tone and its place in the novel. This chapter has instead relies on that other technique that Ellison uses, which is to delay action. The narrator is very much dreading his ultimate interview with Dr. Bledsoe, where he fears getting expelled from the college, and so while he has to wait, we have to wait with him. And so we see Ellison working in this kind of mode too, where the tension simmers and slowly builds. Ultimately, based on the other, given the other technique that he likes to use, which is, action that is cataclysmic, we are now forced to await that, and we have the same sort of dread that the narrator has. The plot so far, at least in the first half of Chapter 5, is relatively straightforward. The narrator is walking to church to go to one of these compulsory services, so they can perform in front of all the rich white northern guests. And so while he's walking, he feels this dread, and what we lack in action in this chapter is more than made up for in imagery, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Once he arrives at the church, after some singing, he recalls when he himself was a speaker as part of his participation in their debate team. And so he recalls the speeches that he made. And we'll talk about how he recalls those or how he feels about those now also in a little bit. And then finally, the last thing we read into the first half of Chapter 5 is a speech, an inspirational speech by a northern preacher who is a friend of the president, the only other black man on the dais with all the rich white donors. So that's the plot as far as that goes. And so, if Ellison isn't interested in a lot of action here, his focus must be on something else. So it's important for us to kind of figure out, well, why is he devoting these last dozen or so pages just to a rather sedate set of acts? And so we have to look at a couple of things. I think the first thing to look at is the mood that is created. And there's all sorts of interesting, there's the dread that the narrator feels as he's waiting for his interview with Bledsoe is shared with us. So right along with the narrator, we are once again paralleling his feeling. And so the mood that we have, this rising tension that we feel, fills us with anxiety, fills us up with dread. And so since it is possible that he's about to be expelled from this Eden-esque place, Ellison makes clear to us just how beautiful it is and how, just how nurturing an environment it is, so that if the narrator is ultimately expelled, we can better appreciate the loss. We can feel it more deeply. In addition to that mood of dread or judgment, which we see talked about in the beginning of the chapter, like on pages 109 and 110, there's also, later in the chapter, he starts feeling disassociated. Everyone else seems to belong and feel properly inspired by their surroundings, but the narrator himself feels estranged from that. And so instead of feeling part of that, he begins to once again feel that same sort of recurring rebellion. There's something about the doctrines that are taught there, the doctrines of submissiveness, humiliation, appreciation, that the narrator no longer feels. And so it's an interesting, conflicted set of feelings he has. On the one hand, he doesn't want to be kicked out of the college. On the other, he doesn't really feel a part of its life anymore. And so there's this same ambiguity that we've seen him feel in other instances. It's probably, more than anything else, this chapter gives Ellison a chance to really indulge in his writing style. He's not so much interested in shocking us with actions, and so instead he impresses us with his array of techniques. For example, we've already begun to talk about the imagery. There's the imagery of the moon, which is bloody and also looks like a white man's eyeball. We've seen the Eden-esque image. This is a kind of Garden of Eden, and you know that when a character is in a Garden of Eden early on in the book, that character can't stay there. There's no opportunity for growth if you are stuck in, if you stay in Eden. That is a trope, a common device that authors use. We saw it used in Candide. We see it used here again. You even see it in Jane Eyre when she's first at Rochester's mansion, and then ultimately realizes that it's not the Eden that she expected, or that she first assumed it was. In addition to that, there's also an interesting image of false hope. You have all these all these black faces looking up to these golden pipes of the organ. The golden pipes of the organ aren't real gold; they're just painted gold, and so there's kind of false hope imagery also used there. And then once again, we see a recurrence of a decapitation image. The black preacher is wearing black garments, and obviously is black complected, but he has a white collar, so it makes it look like his head is being cut off. The other predominant image, though, is just of darkness itself, and the association of darkness with ignorance, and obviously then lightness with enlightenment. And so we hear over and over again, drummed into these young African Americans, this notion that everything that is dark is bad, and that they should disassociate themselves from it, reject it, and move towards more of a whiteness, as light, an extinguishing of the darkness. And then finally, when the Northern preacher is retelling the story of the founder and his coming to his early days, the association there is made to Christ and all the travails that Christ had to go through. And so the imagery that Ellison weaves into this chapter really is quite extraordinary. There's one image on top of another. So while we don't have a lot of frenetic activity, we do have a lot of frenetic imagery and wordplay. So it's almost as if Ellison, no matter which mode he's writing in, either the very active one or the one that is just delaying action and rising tension, he can't hold the impulse to just jam as much as he can into his writing. Which leads us then ultimately to some of the discussion of some of the themes that we see discussed in this first part of the chapter. Obviously, the themes of regret and shame. These young African Americans are taught to reject their early lives, give them up, and become the kind of submissive Negro that the white people will find unthreatening and useful. And so they're made to feel shame, humiliation over the lives they've led up to that moment of arriving in the college. Another theme that is being discussed here, or is touched upon, is this feeling of loss. The narrator very well may be expelled from this college, and as a result, that he's experiencing a loss there. In the same way that he has left his childhood home, now he's contemplating having to leave this college, and so it's a loss of one nurturing environment after another. Which leads to the next discussion, the next theme that is discussed, which is this idea of transformation. There's an interesting use of the word transformation in talking about the young girl who sings and how she is transformed by the music, and everyone else seems to be transformed as well. Obviously, the narrator himself is going through a kind of transformation. The old narrator, or his older consciousness, which has him believing in all the doctrines that the college teaches, to this new consciousness which rejects them. So he himself is transforming from someone who is docile, accepting, humble, to someone who's more assertive and self-validating. And then finally, and you can decide whether this is a theme or more of a stylistic device, but one of the things that we'll look at starting now and then obviously going forward is the power of words. We see the narrator recalling a time when he was a speaker up on the stage. And in that section, I think you can find it on pages 113 and 114, he remembers rhapsodically, ecstatically about his being on that stage and toning his voice up into the rafters and into the very last row where some older woman, a former slave, is sitting. And his desire is to thrill, to overwhelm, to inspire. But as he talks about his speech, he talks about it as if it was just a bunch of empty rhetoric, that he was more interested in the style of the speech than the content. and he didn't really believe in any of the things he was saying. He was more impressed with his ability to move people with words. And we get to see this idea of how words have that kind of power when we hear the speech of the northern preacher who's come down to retell the story of the founder. And his speech is filled with inspiration and is the opposite of the way the narrator thought about his own speech, because the northern preacher's speech is very much genuine and heartfelt. He believes everything he's saying. Even the narrator himself recognizes that his eyes have watered as a result of listening to this speech. And then on top of all of that, kind of overlaying all of that, is Ellison's use of language itself. Ellison seems very impressed with the ability of words to create images and feelings. And so one of the interesting things about this book is that, again, it's running in tandem or in parallel. Just as the narrator has become interested in the power of words, so Ellison also is obviously similarly interested and is using them to great effect. In fact, if you look at the speech that the kind of inner monologue that the narrator gives, you can see all sorts of wordplay going on there, all sorts of alliteration and other devices that he uses. And so Ellison himself is very much interested in the power of words, in the play of them, in the way they can adjust things, manipulate things, create and change things. And so as we go forward, we want to look at how words and their power, how speeches can be just as powerful, maybe even more powerful than physical force. And so that's takes us through the first half of chapter 5. For next time, we'll read the second half of chapter 5, and I will see you then.